Hi everyone, it's Christy. I wanted to give you a quick page through on the notes I've been taking in First Samuel. I started with this note here I clipped out of a resource. Talks about the setting of First Samuel, and it says the book of First Samuel is set in Israel during the time of transition between the period of the judges and the period of the monarchy. It opens with Samuel's birth and then describes his role as judge over Israel. When the people ask for a king, the Lord instructs Samuel to anoint Saul as Israel's first king. And so leadership is the main theme of 1 Samuel. And this is one reason I wanted to spend some time in 1 Samuel, because if you know the story of Saul and David, the first two kings of Israel, there was a huge difference between them. Saul ended up displeasing God, and God chose someone else to be king, and someone else happened to be David, who God says was a man after his own heart. And so contrasting the leadership between the two and what makes one a good leader and another not, it just seems highly relevant right now with all the U.S. political stuff going on, and I'm not going to get into that. I don't really care where you stand on that, but for my sake, I just wanted to take a little closer look at what makes a good leader according to the Bible. And so made a very short outline. Sometimes outlines for a book I'll have subpoints, but I just stuck with the main three areas here. Chapters 1 through 7 is about Samuel. Chapters 8 through 15 is about Saul. And chapters 16 through 31 is the rise of David. He didn't quite become king yet, but he's on the rise. And so, first part, talks about Hannah's prayer. I thought this was some nice notes about Hannah. Her prayer song in chapter 2 celebrates the sovereignty and righteousness of God. She talks about how God defeats the proud and God exalts the humble, and that God protects his faithful ones. Hannah's prayer helps us understand praise. She speaks directly to God. She expresses appreciation for God's character and for his actions. So that's a few notes about praise. Then it talks about Eli and his wicked sons. They were priests and supposed to be serving the Lord, but they didn't do a very good job of it. And that's when God raised up Samuel to be, he raised up Samuel in the temple there to learn the ways of God. And Samuel experiences at a young age God speaking to him, and the Lord establishes a relationship with Samuel. Talks about the Philistines capturing the Ark of the Covenant and the judgment that came on the Philistines as a result of that. The Philistine god that they worshipped, it talks about they took the Ark of the Covenant into the temple of Dagon. Well, Dagon was a god associated with the Philistines who was said to be the father of Baal. Like Baal, Dagon was a grain god or a storm god. Although the word Dagon is similar to the Hebrew word fish, there is no archaeological evidence that he was a sea god. And then I sometimes will make notes about where I got that source. That was from the Holman Bible Dictionary. The Philistines actually had three gods. Dagon was the chief god, Ashtoreth was the fertility goddess, and Beelzebub was god who averted pestilence or plagues. And that name literally means Lord of the Flies. Let's see. Talks about Samuel being both prophet and judge. He administered justice in 4 towns: Bethel, Gilgal, Mitzpah, and Ramah, which was his hometown. We're getting up to chapter 9 is where Saul kind of comes on the scene in 1 Samuel chapter 9. And it kind of sounds like, as you're reading this, it kind of sounds like God didn't want them to have a king. They kind of were begging God to give them a king so that they could be like all the other nations. So when you read through it in the text, it sounds like, well, maybe God didn't want this to happen. But if you go back and look at Deuteronomy 17, verses 14 to 20, God predicted, even under Moses, God predicted that that they would eventually have a king, and God made provisions for when that time comes, what that needs to look like and how that should happen. And another issue that comes up is God's sovereignty, and that God is the one that chose the king out of that same passage. I found a small map that I put here in the margin. It has the area here where Samuel had most of his ministry. And let's see. Saul is confirmed to be the king. The Spirit enables him to have a victory. And let's see. Samuel warns the people against turning away from God. This is at the time when they wanted a king. And Samuel says, okay, if you're going to have a king, then I'm going to basically retire, essentially. And so he warns them about turning away from God. He calls for a destructive storm to prove that their sinful motives in asking for a king, and he calls down this storm. It's been a period of drought, and he calls in a storm. Kind of dramatic flair. Samuel reassures Israel that the Lord will not abandon them, and he also assures them that he will continue to pray for Israel. Saul becomes king, and he reigned 42 years. But very shortly after he became king, God already picked someone else, David. 1 Samuel 13, verse 14. But now your kingdom must end, referring to Saul. For the Lord has sought out a man after his own heart. The Lord has already appointed him to be the leader of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command. Made a note here about the Philistines. It talks about Israel's military disadvantage, and the reason they were at a military disadvantage with the Philistines is because Philistines were experts in metallurgy. They knew how to process metals to create them into metal wheels for their chariots and various weapons. So they had the technology advances that gave them a military advantage over Israel. And moving right along. Chapter 15, God confirms his rejection of Saul, and this time it's final. God rejected Saul because Saul was proud and wanted to do things his way instead of waiting to do it God's way. Then starting in chapter 16, we see the rise of David, and this is a period of both Saul and David, because Saul was still king, but David has already been chosen to be the next king, and so there's kind of a power struggle. David spends most of the rest of the book as a fugitive from Saul. Saul's trying to kill his political opponent because, if David was dead, then Saul wouldn't feel threatened to be replaced. Excuse me while I grabbed a quick drink. So David starts as a musician in Saul's court. David, famously defeats Goliath. But as I was mentioning, Saul becomes jealous and afraid of David, afraid that David's going to take over the kingdom. And David becomes best friends with Saul's son, Jonathan. And so there's a fair amount of discussion about the relationship of David and Jonathan, how Jonathan kind of goes against his father secretly by helping David. David is a fugitive, talks about David and the priests of Nob. Made a note here that during this time, David may have written Psalm 52 and 53 when he was hiding in the cave of Adullam. And, this priest of Nob, and then fleeing to the caves of Adullam. He may have also written Psalm 142 here. Saul murders the Lord's priests because of what happened at Nob, and because he felt like they helped David escape. David protects the town of Keilah and is betrayed, so he hides in the wilderness again where he's protected by God. David spares Saul's life twice. And then we also see an encounter with David and Nabal, in which Nabal is kind of rude to David, and David could have killed him, but he spared his life. And that's also a story that involves Abigail, who later becomes David's wife. One of David's wives. David, at some point, he's still, fleeing from Saul. So he goes to hide among the Philistines, which are Israel's enemies. So he thought he would be safe there. But this was a really low time in David's life. David's despair. He tricked the Philistines into letting him stay there, basically. And then chapters 28 to 31 talk about Saul's last days. He consults a medium or witch. And once again, God spares David. The Philistines rejected David, but God was faithful once again. God strengthens David. And then the final chapter is the death of Saul, where he came to a shameful end. And this little insert I put in here, it's the events of 1st and 2nd Samuel that are referenced in the Psalms. And so because it has both 1st and 2nd Samuel, I put it right here at the end between 1st Samuel and 2nd Samuel. So out of 1st Samuel could have come Psalm 59, 56, 34, 57, 142, 52, 63, and 54. So those are psalms that are likely to be related to the events of 1 Samuel that David may have written at various times when he was, before he became king, but when he was on the run, fleeing for his life and so forth. And one of the things that you'll find in David's psalms that are in this vein is that he's crying out to God, and that it really gives a picture of how we can share our emotions with God and just pour out our hearts to him. So that's my quick little overview of 1 Samuel and the kind of the types of notes I've made in 1 Samuel so far. I hope that this inspires you to maybe take a few notes of your own. Don't be afraid to write in your Bible, because there's no way you could ever remember all these little details, and so writing them down helps you to be able to refer back to them over and over. So thanks for watching. God bless you, and I will see you in a future video. Bye.